Hello to everyone and welcome to Energy Capital News. I'm Ana Tafoya and today I'm with Todd Frank, Regional Marketing Manager at Burns & McDonnell. I'm also with Martin Van Sickels, President of MVS Consulting LLC and Executive Director of the RISE Global Engineering and Construction Forum. Todd and Martin will talk with us about the future of the engineering and construction industry under the culture of commoditization and globalization. Could you tell us more about the culture of commoditization in the engineering and construction industry?
Over the course of my career, I've seen a continuous focus on price reduction as a reaction to owners' pressures. And Goodhart's law says when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And so I see this focus on cost drive certain behaviors that have really created some challenges for the industry. And while some of the innovation that we have created is great, I think some of the trends that we see may be not so great. And I will say that our innovation investments, the money that we spend towards innovation, is really focused on efficiency and cost reduction fairly consistently. And our basis is to estimate the scope as it's provided by the owner, and it results in a dollar per hour measurement. I mean, that's how we are evaluated today for each proposal we submit. And I do understand that the challenge is held by my friends in supply chain and the owners. I do get it that these are incredibly complex bids, and they're almost impossible to compare an apples to apples comparison. But I've watched how this has affected us overall. And I do remember a bid years and years ago for a major integrated oil company. And we had a reverse auction when reverse auctions were popular. And our blended all-in rate, a single number, was based on all of the types of engineers and project support professionals that we were projecting would be on this program. And so at the end of the day, I mean, a single number, a dollar per hour that was put in there. And we went in with what you call the ceiling bid, the top bid that you might put in to see if you would make the first round of cuts. We did make that first round of cuts. And then what you would do is prior to the reverse auction, you would establish a floor bid, right? How low will you go? And at that point you stop, right? Well, after 7 hours of what was supposed to be a 1 hour live auction, we wound up winning the bid. We were the preferred engineer for this particular client. And the file name on the submittal that I was asked to clean up to submit to the client was actually sub-basement bid. We went far below our floor bid in order to secure this work. And to be perfectly honest, we were fairly fortunate that we didn't get a whole lot of work out of the bid because we would have been losing dollars every time we pursued any of the work. And this is not a healthy environment. It's just not. And that was probably 20 years ago at this point. And it just continues on and continues to kind of impact the industry.
Yeah, you can see this particularly in when you're doing a capital bid. First cost seems to count more than anything else. Now that's not quite always the same, particularly with Western companies, but as you move outside of in the Far East, the Middle East, first cost, it's all if you're bidding a license package and it's just a license fee and a package where it's maybe a couple of % of the value of the entire job is awarded on first cost, not the cost of the ultimate job that's going to be done. This is a very bad trend. People are not buying on value. You see this all over, huh? And everything is short-term mind, and part of that's driven particularly in the West by stock market. They got to be profitable within the next 6, not long-term. Everything is driven by the next press release for stock price, next meeting of, announcement of where you are. And so we got this very short horizon, and it's very difficult to deal in that environment.
That they buy cost, we sell value, right? And there's a discrepancy there that causes a rift between owners and contractors. We're trying to explain to them the value of what we are selling to them and providing to them. Whereas at the end of the day, they evaluate it based on the cost that they have to pay, right? And it's just a philosophical difference. It's very, very challenging.
So in this regard, how are technology enablers affecting the engineering and construction industry, and particularly future engineers, in terms of knowledge, experience, abilities?
Our technology partners, the suppliers that develop the systems and programs and tools that we use are amazing. And the things that they have provided us to do are absolutely phenomenal. The fact is, today we can design a plant and do a virtual walkthrough of it before a single piece of dirt is moved, right? and I've seen that change happen in 25 years. And I mean, it is, and now here we are talking to each other. I mean, the connectivity that we have globally is phenomenal, right? I mean, we're sitting here talking from 2 separate countries and 3 different cities. And the fact is, we can do engineering from 7 different offices in 5 different continents. I mean, why not? But Martin and I were talking about this, and I will never forget what my first boss said. And my first boss didn't have a computer. He refused to have one in his office. His emails were printed for him by his admin, right? And she would bring them in for him. And so I looked at him a bit of a fuddy-duddy, to be perfectly honest, but he was an incredibly knowledgeable engineer, an incredibly knowledgeable project manager. And Jim said to me one day, "Todd, engineers today can't use a slide rule, and that disturbs me." And I laughed. I said, Why, Jim? I mean, we've got these amazing tools at our disposal. And he said that they don't understand the fundamentals. They don't understand that when they put some numbers into a program and it spits out the answer, they don't intuitively know if that answer is wrong, if they've mistyped an input, right? They're disconnected from it, the practical application of these numbers and this data. And that's a problem. And I've remembered that since he said it to me, and I think I had been on the job for a month when he said it to me, right? So I get it. And I think that the more technology gets ingrained in our day-to-day activities, the potential exists for us to become more and more disconnected from the fundamentals. And Martin and I have spoken about this, and I'm sure he'll add to it, but we've watched the business get offshored overseas, and we see the opportunity for it to get reshored with the advent of artificial intelligence into our business, right? We can bring this work back, but basically we're bringing it back and we're plugging it all into a computer to design these plants for us. And what happens 20 years after that, right? When engineers have not actually gotten their hands into the design of these things, and all of a sudden this computer tells you this is the best design for the application, and they won't really understand why. That poses a challenge.
That need to be of concern when we're using these tools, and you're not going to eliminate these tools. It's not, we don't turn back the clock. It's how we use them going forward, and simple things like design margins. I mean, these tools are now so precise that, if you say, I want 1,000 ton a day plant, it turns out 1,000 ton a day plant. And maybe you have some safety things in there, but it'll turn out, where I build this plant, it'll make 1,000 tons. It won't make 1,100. It may make 1,050. Whereas 20 years ago, you built a plant, some got way over designed, but there was a significantly more margin in these things because humans were involved more. And so you build 1,000 ton plant, you might make 1,200 tons a day. Be able to do that with minor adjustments and modifications. But when you take these kinds of things like that, there is no longer, the design is so tight, and you can't debottleneck the plant. And I think a lot of owners are going to find that as they go forward, in the past I was able to, when I get into this thing, I add some more pumps, I do other things. I can get another 15% out, they're going to get Zippo because the plant is, been so precisely designed, and leaves no margin for error. That's a challenge. I mean, that's something that I think a lot of owners don't recognize yet. The other thing is that as we become more efficient, the engineers, in theory, should have more time to think about the problem and what's the solution. But what happens is, no, we're going to drive all the costs down. So we're going to use less engineering hours. Yeah, we should be reducing the engineering hours, but not, there should be enough left in there now to do some time to optimize. Let's put the right word. And you don't see that. I mean, everything's, again, this cost, low cost. And until owners start, and we understand the pressure on the owners, but till they recognize that the engineering companies need some overhead to provide the quality that they expect in the future, to develop the young engineers. That's an important thing, to teach them the fundamentals. And if you don't see the fundamentals, you don't know, as Todd said, the answer comes out. The computer is right. I guess it is. I've sat in meetings where some of the basic stuff is not known. They're just assuming. I mean, I'd sit there and say, well, you change the temperature of the water by 5 degrees, you're going to change the flow rate by boom. And they look at me in amazement. Yeah. And you can't do, that's got to stop. You need to get people, where they do have a sense of what's coming out of the computer.
The fact is, does Watson, is Watson able to think creatively, right? I mean, you give it a plot plan and you give it a design or the requirements of a facility, and it's going to fill that plot plan with the facility. Whereas I know I've been around certain engineers that looked at that same plot plan and said, well, if we went vertically, we could actually save a lot of space and be able to add in new trains. Well, and then all of a sudden it was this revelation, right? I've seen engineers go in there and look at a particular site, and the requirement was to basically move tremendous amounts of earth to, again, put this plant in a particular configuration, which is kind of how it's always been done. And all of a sudden, the engineer says, rather than moving that mountain, why don't we build it in the valley and make it a linear, longer piece? And again, it was to tremendous savings and really very low cost. It was an insightful aspect that this one engineer looked at it and went, what if we did it differently, right? I'm not sure that, maybe the computers can run all the permutations, but I'm not sure that they can, because they're only as good as we program them, right? So again, like Martin said, absolutely invaluable. And we need to continue to use them and innovate with them and all that. But personally, I see a danger.
For the US, which are some challenges globalization of the engineering and construction workforce has brought into the industry.
Well, labor is the highest cost on any project, right? And we sought, again, to continuously drive down labor costs in the U.S. E&C markets. And unfortunately, the attempts to start to offshore this, I think, aligned a lot with the 1980s downturn or the impacts of the 1980s downturn in seeking to reduce cost and find alternative labor sources, because we also had, I believe, a reduction in STEM output, right? People graduating with STEM degrees as engineers in the United States, whereas we saw an uptick in overseas groups. And so we were able to marry the two, find a lower labor cost source with very, very good engineers just in alternative locations. And of course, that even predated the technology advances that we have now, which enable us to communicate even more. The impact of that was, as we moved into one market, we found a location, we established it, we developed an offshore engineering center. And over time, those engineers got better and better. The costs went up as their labor costs went up. and the market got saturated by competition. Again, labor costs went up, and so we moved on to another place, right? So, the Manila today is what Mumbai was in 1991, right? We've just moved on city to city. And so we've basically created this global engineering community, which is fabulous. It's amazing that we have all of this horsepower around the world. But also those lower cost centers are now starting to do work locally, right? They're able to build projects in their own space as opposed to having to work for the US. And now they're becoming competition for us as well. I mean, our former employees are working for the overseas competitors who are now moving into the United States, which is a great thing. I mean, competition's a wonderful thing, but over time, it's just going to drive costs down even further. They may be able to and are, in fact, more cost competitive than U.S. engineering companies. I don't mean to make this a U.S.-centric discussion, in all honesty. I mean, I recognize this as a global group of owners, a global group of suppliers, and a global group of engineering and construction contractors. But the impacts are probably most directly impactfful, if you will, to the U.S. E&C firms. That's where we're seeing the majority of these bankruptcies and consolidations. And we at Rice Global Forum see it a lot just in our membership, not because people are not renewing, it's because they're combining company after company.
20 years ago, we'd have the U.S. contractors have strong relationships with many overseas contractors, and the experience would be balanced. You go with somebody who had lots of construction experience in a country, and you had the engineering, but you rarely ever saw the reverse. And part of that is, now coming back, these local countries, actually become restrictive. They want those new engineering companies to do the business in their country. And so, but they also want them to go out in the world and peddle their wares. And they do so in the U.S. because the U.S. has almost no restrictions from a company, coming in to be a competitor. It is a sort of an unlevel playing field in that respect. I mean, the Japanese companies 10 years ago had no presence in the U.S. other than sales representatives or representatives to liaison with the U.S. contractors. Today, they're active. We've got active engineering offices that are competing against companies like Todd's and others, which is okay, but you go try to do that in Japan, it won't work. You won't sell anything in Japan that way. Just not going to happen. So I don't know how you solve that problem, but it's a difference in how countries operate. It's a significant issue. And we're even seeing, one of the major Indian engineering companies now have a presence in the U.S.
In this regard, which could be some actions E&C companies can address to improve the health of the supply chain in a globalized world?
As with most things, I think education is the key, right? I mean, I do know that they acknowledge and recognize that this makes things certainly difficult for us. I mean, we've communicated that, we talk with them about that, but their business is difficult too, challenging as well. I mean, they're competing with other owners, right? And at the end of the day, trying to capture market share just like we are as well. But I sit there and I think back to the fact that years ago I worked for a company that was so good at what we did that we had two owners approach us, major IOCs, names that they both wanted us to support them in their efforts to secure a lease in the Middle East. And so they had proposals to submit, and so we had to design the work for them so that they could submit their proposals. And we approached them and said, hey, your competitor wants us to work for them. And how do we handle this? And we want to work for you, and they want us to work for them, right? And they both said, we want you. We absolutely both want you. And so if you can establish a secure method for separating the teams and making sure that our information is confidential, then that's fine. You can work for our competitors as well. And so we did just that. To the point where we didn't even talk about the projects internally until they were done. I mean, the teams were totally separate. So discussions were not had in hallways or at the lunchroom about those projects, only in the secure project area. And at the end of the day, and of course, those two companies were competing against additional companies. So we were proud of the fact that both of them wanted us to work for them, but we were also proud of the fact that one of them actually won the lease. The sad thing is that company has been purchased. The company that purchased it has been purchased. And that company has recently shut down the capital projects division. It just wasn't lucrative for them. So you took a fantastic company that 20 years later is gone. And it's not because they got worse at what they did, they just couldn't be cost competitive over time. Maybe that was mismanagement, maybe it was challenging, but I just see it as a trend in the industry. I mean, I talked to a lot of different E&C companies as a part of a member of the Rise Global Forum, right?
I think, one of the things that we need to do is diversify the supply chain a lot more. It's okay to have a supply chain, but this COVID thing, it shows you clearly, when you get one player, okay, has too much of the piece, that's a really huge weakness in the system. China, it's been exposed now, that you got too much vulnerability. And that's not to say that they've done something wrong. We've let it happen to ours. But, we need to think about, what percentage of our market. I mean, it's like the owners won't put, if you have a job that's occupying 70% of your workforce in a single office, they won't put another project in there. It's a similar analogy. Well, you shouldn't be, using up more than probably 25% of the workforce for any office for a given project. You shouldn't be procuring your steel from 100% of it from one country. Now you may 100% for a given project, but over your span of number of projects, you haven't diversified where it's, you're not dependent on every, one source. It's not as easy, that's easy said, not easy done, but it's something that I think most of the owners and the contractors recognize they probably need to do. It may cost them a little bit more, but it gives them the ability to not have a crisis in one of this, if a single supply area breaks up, whether they're problems, political problems or whatever.
The pandemic has truly made us crystal clear on the fact that the offshoring of manufacturing that occurred, driven purely by cost reasons, right? I mean, at the end of the day, that's what it was all about. We found that we could, in partners overseas, they could produce things cheaper, and that was what demand was, and that caused, the companies that were making those things to become more profitable. And at the end of the day, all of a sudden a pandemic happens and we can't access the things that we need, right? And so, what we do as an industry is critical. I mean, it is critical. And the fact that you would commoditize engineering and engineering construction industry is problematic to me. I had a project director I worked with years ago who made the statement that if a lawyer is bad at their job, their client goes to jail. If a doctor is bad at their job, their client can pass away. If an engineer is bad at their job, thousands of people can die. I mean, it can impact the generations of people. It's phenomenal. And, we try not to commoditize the legal industry or the medical profession, but we have certainly done that to our industry. And we are actually seeing it happen in the other industries as well.
What is the role of partnerships between companies and the adoption of a more performance-based approach?
What I'm probably going to say might sound a little socialistic and probably the most capitalistic of all industries. right? But at the end of the day, I think target-based contracts with incentives have always produced the best outcomes from my experience. Martin may agree or disagree, but that's just what I see. When you can work together to develop the scope, and then work together to develop and agree upon an estimate, and then work together to either share the benefits if you come in under that estimate, or share the cost if you go over that estimate. That seems to be the right approach to contracting. And at the end of the day, no one's going to win if contractors all go out of business. I mean, that's all there is to it, right? I mean, the owners need us, we need the owners. We as a society need the entire industry. I mean, the suppliers need us as well, right? But if we continue on the trends that we are going down, and don't take another look at partnering, which I think became, I don't know, Martin, I mean, maybe you have more insights as to why it became such a negative term in the industry. I mean, other than the fact that I think that over time, when you quote unquote partner together, owners may have seen us as our pencils got less sharp, right? It's driven to be as focused on driving cost out of the projects and being as optimized in the execution of projects as we should be. When the fact is, when you work together over time, you build trust, and there's a value in trust, right? You can move faster when you and your owner partner know what is expected of each other.
You mentioned about need to work closer together and with a partner and take on this approach where you share with the upside and the downside. The difficulty we have today, I think part of the difficulty is owners have downsized their engineering departments. In the past, some of these owners actually legacy engineering companies are spin-outs from operating companies that had huge engineering. They spun them out, but they still retained large engineering forces that worked hand in hand with the contractors. When you reduce those numbers of people on the owner side, the tendency is to drive it towards fixed pricing, not an open cost, not working together. Because I can't monitor this thing, so I'm going to just fix the price. I want a lump sum price, and that way I can control the project. It's that's an issue that comes about, and you see it more and more. Companies have reduced more and more their home office engineering staff that would normally have manage the contractors well, even under lump sum prices. Fixed prices, but we've lost that. The other thing I'd offer an observation over the years for me with partnerships, and they were, in the late 80s and early 90s, that was a big buzzword, particularly partnerships. There's always been partnerships between contractors for given projects, and usually they work pretty good if you got a well-written agreement. But the owner ones, they start off with well intentions, and they almost always seem to fall apart. And I agree with Todd's observation that some of that could be, not keeping your pencil sharp enough and that kind of thing. But it also comes about when there's a downturn in the industry the owner's in. And they forget the objective, and they now are pinching pennies everywhere. And we entered into this agreement 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and it's been working well, but here's Joe Schmo over here, and they'll give us $1 an hour less, and they go that way. And it's again this first cost mentality. You see that happen, and I think a large number of the partnerships between owners and contractors have had that happen to them. I may be wrong about that, but I've seen enough of it that I believe that's a significant driving, force. It just becomes again, a cost issue. They're not willing to take the dip. They were willing to have the contractor limit his profitability on the high side when things got good and got really busy, we would still maintain our position on the contracts where we would staff them at that level, and we had agreed upon pricing and all that kind of thing. But the owners have many of them have a different view, that when it goes the other way, well, you guys should be lowering your cost and not raising them, but you can't raise them, but you can lower them.
Yeah, and you see that, right, when the downturn happens, the owners put additional pressures on us. When the up cycle happens and all of a sudden engineering is in short supply and they need help in executing these projects rapidly, like we saw in 2006, 2007, early 2008, the reverse happens. I mean, you know, they just need help, as much help as they can get, and they're willing to pay anything that they need to in order to get it done. Which isn't healthy for them either.
But in a partnership, they expect you not to be paying everything, you know,
Exactly.
not paying the going market rate any longer, the upside market rate.
Sure.
You know, and the whole deal is supposed to be to level things out.
Throughout the ups and the downs, absolutely.
Yeah, right.
And that's where in my opinion, we probably need to get to at some point.
Yeah.
I don't know if we ever will.
But the free market, though, it creates always a problem. I mean,
Sure.
The owners are, get tempted, and then there's always it's very easy to start an engineering company. You know, it's a relatively low cost to start up an engineering company. So there's always some new kid on the block.
What's the solution? I think the solution goes back to what Martin said at the beginning of this conversation, which is, that we move beyond the cost question to the value question.